Under the sterile glow of harsh laboratory lights, Raina's once luminous green skin had taken on a grayish hue, her vibrant eyes dulled by the cruel monotony of her imprisonment. Her slender arms, restrained by cold metal bands, lay motionless as she gazed at the ceiling, the hum of machinery echoing in her ears. Memories of her home planet, Evora, a world of cascading silver rivers and endless fields bathed in starlight, were now mere fragments, slipping further away each day. Subject Z9. A voice crackled over the intercom, the tone clinical, dispassionate. Dr. Morin, head of this cover-human facility, stepped into the room with brisk footsteps. His gaze, cold and calculating, swept over Raina, a mixture of scientific curiosity and something darker glinting in his eyes. "Today, we'll continue our tests on your neural capacities," he stated, raising a syringe filled with a glistening blue serum. Raina's pulse quickened, but she kept silent. She had learned by now that her protests only amused them. Her only act of rebellion was her silence, a defiant refusal to acknowledge them. As the needle approached, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. The lights flickered, and the floor trembled underfoot. Dr. Morin glanced around, momentarily unsettled. Then, through the hazy smoke and flashing alarms, Raina saw a figure moving toward her, a man, human, with a look of fierce determination in his eyes. "Are you Raina?" he asked, voice low but urgent as he quickly began undoing her restraints. Raina, disoriented but with a flicker of hope, nodded slowly. Who are you?" "My name's Cade," he replied, glancing back toward the door. "I came here for something else, but when I found out about you—" His voice trailed off as he freed her last restraint and pulled her to her feet. "No one deserves this." The door burst open, and a guard lunged toward Cade, who quickly deflected the blow, knocking the man out cold. Raina watched, amazed, as Cade turned to her with a slight grin. "Can you run?" She nodded, the unfamiliar rush of adrenaline giving her strength. As they dashed into the labyrinthine corridors, the full force of her predicament hit her. She was risking everything, fleeing into the unknown with a stranger. But for the first time in months, she felt the faint warmth of hope stirring in her chest. The corridors were a twisting maze of sterile white walls, dimly lit by flickering lights as the alarm system continued its deafening blare. Cade led Raina down one hallway after another, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't being followed. Raina's legs, weak from months of confinement, stumbled a few times, but Cade's steady grip kept her moving forward. As they rounded a corner, Raina couldn't help but glance back, the weight of her fear pressing down on her. She had been conditioned to believe escape was impossible, that the walls around her were impenetrable. Yet here she was, tearing through the facility with a human who seemed ready to risk everything to set her free. They reached a metal door at the end of a long corridor, and Cade tapped at the control panel beside it. "This should take us to the service tunnels," he explained. "Once we're through, it's just a short run to the surface." The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a narrow passage that smelled faintly of damp metal and stale air. Cade pushed her forward, his urgency spurring her onward. But just as they stepped inside, the lights in the passage flickered, and the door behind them slammed shut. A voice boomed through the speakers, Dr. Morin's. "Cade, you fool," Morin sneered. "Did you think you'd get far? She's more valuable to us than you know." Raina froze, her heart pounding as Morin's voice echoed in the narrow tunnel. She looked at Cade, fear etched in her eyes. But Cade simply took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "We're getting out of here, Raina. Morin can't stop us." They broke into a sprint down the passage, Morin's taunting voice fading behind them. Raina's senses were sharp, her instincts kicking in as they navigated through twists and turns, deeper into the tunnels. For the first time since her capture, she felt alive, adrenaline and terror intertwining, guiding her every step. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber, dimly lit by the soft, distant glow of moonlight. An air vent high above offered a glimpse of the sky, a promise of freedom. Cade looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "This is it, Reyna. We just have to climb." She nodded, determination sparking in her once dull eyes. Together, they scaled the walls, Cade helping her over each obstacle, until at last they reached the vent. With a forceful push, Cade broke the vent cover open, and Reyna breathed in the fresh night air. They climbed out, collapsing onto the grassy ground under the open sky. The stars stretched endlessly above them, like tiny beacons of hope. Reyna looked at Cade, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I thought I'd never see the stars again." He smiled, brushing dirt from his clothes. "You don't owe me anything, Reyna. Just live." But she looked at him with a fierce resolve. "I want to do more than that. Let me show you a world beyond this one." As dawn approached, they walked together into the unknown, two unlikely allies bound by a shared fight for freedom. Reyna's heart swelled with hope, not only for herself, but for Cade, who had proven that humanity held more kindness than she'd believed. The wilderness around them was quiet as they moved away from the facility, their footsteps soft against the forest floor. A faint mist clung to the trees, swirling around them as dawn began to break, casting soft rays of light through the branches. Reyna had never felt this kind of freedom before, and with each step, she felt more of the facility's cold grip slipping away. Yet, an uneasy feeling lingered. Dr. Morin wasn't one to let his prized experiment go easily. Cade seemed to sense her worry. As they reached a clearing, he motioned for her to rest, his gaze scanning the trees behind them. "We should be safe here for a moment," he said, "but we can't stay long. I'm sure Morin's already got people looking for us." Reyna nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of daylight were emerging. "Thank you again. I don't understand why you would risk so much for me. I'm just a stranger to you." Cade's expression softened. "Maybe you're a stranger, but you didn't deserve what they were doing to you. I couldn't just leave you there." Reyna studied him, seeing a depth in his gaze she hadn't noticed before. "You don't work for Morin, do you? Then why were you even there?" Cade looked away, his jaw tightening. "I used to work with Morin a long time ago. I didn't know what he'd become, or how far he'd go in his experiments." His voice dropped, laced with regret. "I went back to confront him, but I didn't expect to find someone like you there." Reyna's heart ached at the thought of her imprisonment as just a part of a greater cruelty. But here, with Cade, she realized she wasn't alone in her suffering. His own past, though different, mirrored her own pain in a way she hadn't expected. After a brief pause, Cade continued, "You mentioned your world. The rivers, the fields of starlight. Do you think you could go back?" Reyna's gaze drifted to the sky, where thin clouds scattered in the early light. "Evra feels like a dream now," she murmured. "I don't even know if I'd be welcome. But there's another way." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Another way?" She took a steadying breath. "My people have an ability, a connection to the stars. I can't explain it, but if I can reach out, they might be able to find me." Cade's eyes lit with curiosity, a small glimmer of hope. "So if we can get you somewhere safe, you could call for help." Reyna nodded. "But it takes time and concentration, and I don't know what Morin's done to my mind. It might not even work." Cade placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make it work, whatever it takes." With renewed resolve, they moved through the forest, their steps cautious but purposeful. As they neared the edge of the woods, Reyna closed her eyes, reaching deep within herself, searching for that ancient link to her people. She felt a faint warmth flicker, but it was elusive, like a distant star just beyond her grasp. Cade glanced at her, concern in his eyes. "Reyna, are you all right?" She opened her eyes, frustration shadowing her features. "I'll need more time, but I'll keep trying." They pressed on, reaching a quiet clearing beside a lake, just as the sun began to rise fully. The calm water mirrored the dawn sky, casting a serene reflection across its surface. Reyna felt an urge to wade into the water, the instinctual pull of something ancient and comforting. Cade watched as she knelt by the lake, her fingers skimming the water's surface. "Is this part of your ritual?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Water helps. On Evora, we have rivers that glow under the stars. I can still feel them, in a way." Sensing her focus, Cade took a step back, giving her the space she needed. Reyna closed her eyes again, allowing the stillness of the lake to seep into her. She felt the pull of the stars, faint and wavering. But there, she reached out to them, sending a silent, urgent call for help across the vast distance between worlds. As she concentrated, the lake's surface began to shimmer, a faint glow spreading outward. Her heart leaped. Her message was going through, at least partly. But then she felt a disruption, a dark pulse pushing back, a familiar coldness that sent a chill down her spine. Cade noticed her shudder. "What is it?" Reyna opened her eyes, a look of dread replacing her hope. "Morin. He's tracking us somehow." Cade's face hardened. "Then we'll have to keep moving. But I won't let him take you back, Reyna. Whatever happens, I promise." Reyna looked at him, feeling a rare surge of gratitude. For the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Together, they would face whatever was coming, each step forward bound by trust, and a growing resolve to break free from the shadows of their past. The sun was climbing higher as they left the lake behind, casting warm light across the landscape. Reyna felt the strain of her failed connection with her people, but Cade's presence steadied her. They moved through the dense forest in silence, each listening for any sound of pursuit. The feeling that Dr. Morin was close loomed over them, growing heavier with each step. Cade paused and turned to her, his expression somber. "We can't keep going like this forever. Morin will catch up unless we find a way to stop him." Reyna nodded, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "Then let's stop running." They found a small, hidden clearing deep in the forest, where the trees offered cover and shadows cloaked them in safety. Cade began to scout the perimeter, looking for any sign of movement, while Reyna sat cross-legged on the ground, trying to calm her mind. She could feel a faint ache where the blue serum had been injected, as if it were interfering with her ability to connect with her people. Cade knelt beside her, whispering, "Any chance you can reach out again?" Reyna took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She focused on the warmth of Evora, on the feeling of home. The starlit rivers, the endless skies. Slowly, the stars in her mind brightened, each a distant beacon of hope. She reached toward them, her mind stretching across the galaxies, her silent plea for help ringing out. Suddenly, a flicker of recognition rippled through her, like a distant voice answering her call. Her pulse quickened. "I think they're hearing me," she whispered, her voice full of astonished hope. But just as quickly as the connection formed, a cold, invasive presence surged in, drowning out the warmth of her memories. She gasped, clutching her head as her vision blurred, seeing flashes of Morin's cold, calculating gaze. Cade was at her side instantly. "Reyna, what's happening?" "Morin," she managed through gritted teeth. "He's using something, tracking me through the serum. I can feel him trying to break in." Cade's eyes darkened. "Then it's time to sever that link. We have to get that serum out of your system." Together, they scoured the forest for herbs and plants Cade knew from his training. Plants that could help counteract foreign substances. He created a makeshift poultice, pressing it against her skin near the injection site. And though the relief was faint, she felt the sharpness of Morin's hold begin to weaken. They rested briefly, Reyna's breathing slowly easing as the forest grew quieter. But that silence shattered as a low rumble rose from the forest's edge, the unmistakable sound of armed soldiers moving through the brush. Morin had found them. Cade clenched his fists, his voice a low murmur. "They're closing in, but we're not giving up." He helped her to her feet, his arm a steadying presence around her shoulders. They backed away from the approaching sounds, slipping through the shadows. Just when they thought they'd lost the soldiers, a figure stepped into their path. It was Morin, his face twisted in a satisfied sneer. "You didn't really think you could escape me, did you?" Morin's voice was venomous, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Cade stepped protectively in front of Reyna. "She's not your experiment, Morin. Let her go." Morin's gaze shifted to Cade, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "You were supposed to understand. Science demands sacrifice. Her kind could be our salvation. She's an asset to be studied, not some pet to be freed." Reyna's hand tightened around Cade's arm as she glared at Morin. "I'm not an asset. I'm not yours." Morin took a step forward, his expression darkening. "Your resistance only makes this more painful, Reyna." In that moment, a surge of anger coursed through her, awakening something deep within her. Her eyes began to glow with a faint green light, her body pulsing with energy she hadn't felt before. The forest seemed to respond, the leaves rustling as if sensing her fury. She focused her thoughts on her people's starlit energy, letting it flow through her, a power she didn't yet understand but could feel guiding her. Cade took a step back, awestruck. "Reyna, what's happening?" Her voice was steady, though filled with quiet fury. "I'm remembering who I am." Morin's smirk faded as he recognized the power radiating from her. "Interesting. Perhaps this is an unforeseen opportunity." But Reyna was done with his games. She extended her hand, and to her astonishment, a shimmering, translucent shield formed between them. Morin's face twisted in surprise as he tried to step forward, only to be met by an invisible barrier that kept him at bay. Cade's grin was one of awe and pride. "Looks like the tables have turned, Morin." The soldiers hesitated, looking at each other in confusion as Reyna's energy expanded, the glow illuminating the darkening forest. She felt a connection to her people once again, stronger than before. The presence that had answered her earlier call grew closer, filling her with the warmth of Everest's stars. Morin's voice, now tinged with desperation, broke the silence. "This isn't over, Reyna. You can't escape what you are." Reyna met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "No, Morin. I'm reclaiming who I am. And that has nothing to do with you." In one final surge of energy, she projected a wave of light that swept through the forest, momentarily blinding Morin and his men. Cade took her hand, and they turned, slipping away into the shadows as Morin's angry shouts echoed behind them. As they ran, Reyna felt a strange calm settle over her. She was still far from home, still pursued, but now she knew she wasn't powerless. Her people had answered her call, and with Cade by her side, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Reyna and Cade kept moving until the shouts of Morin and his soldiers faded, the forest once again a sanctuary of silence. The glow in Reyna's skin slowly dimmed, her energy waning as they pushed onward. Exhausted but determined, they finally stopped at a hidden alcove where thick vines provided cover. As they settled, Cade cast a worried glance at her. "Are you all right?" Whatever that power was, it looked like it took a toll. Reyna managed a small nod, though she felt the ache of her energy drain deep in her bones. "I'll be fine. But that surge, it's something new. I didn't know I could do that." Cade watched her with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Maybe the serum activated something latent, or maybe your people's connection strengthened because you're in danger." His voice softened. "Either way, it's something Morin didn't anticipate. And that's our advantage." Reyna took a deep breath, centering herself. She had felt the presence of her people, a familiar warmth like starlight, but it was still too faint to hold onto for long. Her mind raced with the knowledge that Morin and his forces wouldn't rest until she was back under their control. Yet, for the first time, she had a power of her own, a connection to Evora, and an ability she hadn't fully unlocked. In that moment, a soft hum filled the air, growing steadily louder. Reyna and Cade both looked up, startled, as a faint light appeared in the sky, descending toward them. The light intensified, and Reyna felt a strange resonance within her chest, as if it were calling to her. The light took shape, revealing a sleek, crystalline spacecraft that landed smoothly in a nearby clearing. Reyna's eyes widened, recognition flashing in her gaze. "It's Ivorian." "They heard me," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The hatch of the ship opened, and a tall figure emerged, their skin glowing with the same faint luminescence as Reyna's. The figure moved with grace, their eyes warm yet intense, radiating a calm authority. "Reyna of Evora." The figure spoke, their voice carrying an echo of distant stars. "We receive your call. I am Lyra, sent by the Council of Elders to bring you home." Overwhelmed, Reyna stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I didn't know if you would find me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They've kept me prisoner for so long." Lyra's expression softened. "We know of their cruelty, and we will ensure you are safe." She looked at Cade, her gaze assessing. "And you are?" "Cade," he replied, standing tall despite the otherworldly presence before him. "I helped Reyna escape. I couldn't leave her to that prison." Lyra inclined her head, a faint smile crossing her face. "Your bravery is noted, Cade of Earth. Evora values its allies." But before they could say more, an explosion rocked the clearing, and the trees shuddered as soldiers, led by Morin himself, stormed through the undergrowth. His face was twisted in a mixture of rage and determination as he took in the sight of the Ivorian ship. "You think you can just leave?" Morin snarled, pulling a weapon from his belt and pointing it at Reyna. "You are a resource, not a person. You belong to this facility." Lyra stepped between Reyna and Morin, her gaze fierce and unyielding. "Reyna belongs to Evora, and she will not be taken again." She raised her hands, a shimmering barrier forming between them and the soldiers, holding back Morin's forces. Cade turned to Reyna, his face resolute. "Go with her. I'll cover you." Reyna's heart clenched as she glanced between Cade and Lyra. "I won't leave you behind." He gave her a small, sad smile. "This is your chance, Reyna. You're finally free." But before she could protest, Lyra grasped her hand firmly. "Reyna, we must leave. Now." As they turned to the ship, Cade moved to face Morin and his soldiers. He ducked behind trees, evading their shots as they pressed forward, his gaze darting back to Reyna once, a wordless farewell. As Reyna stepped into the ship, her vision blurred with tears. The hatch closed, and she could see Cade through the viewport, standing alone but unyielding as the ship's engines roared to life. Lyra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He made his choice. Honor it by living freely. The ship ascended, leaving the forest and the humans far below. As they soared into the sky, Reyna closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her home planet calling her back. The stars were waiting, and she knew she would carry Cade's memory with her always. As Reyna finally returned to the starlit fields and silver rivers of Evora, she knew her journey was far from over. She would speak of the human strength and kindness, of Cade's sacrifice, and of Morin's cruelty. And someday, if fate allowed, she would find a way to repay Cade's courage. With each starlit night on Evora, she would look up, remembering the world that had given her hope, and the human who had set her free.